The early morning sun cast long shadows across the 5 acres that Staff Sergeant Andre Williams called home. At 34, he had accomplished what many thought impossible. A black man from humble beginnings owning a beautiful ranch on the outskirts of San Antonio. The property wasn't fancy by Texas standards, but to Andre, it represented everything he had worked for. 8 years ago, the land had been little more than an overgrown mess with a dilapidated house that most buyers overlooked. Where others saw problems, Andre saw possibility. The selling price had been just within reach of his savings and military housing allowance. The real estate agent had raised her eyebrows when he made the offer, questioning if he understood what he was getting into. "This place needs more than a little TLC," she had warned, gesturing toward the sagging porch and weed-choked pastures. "And there's an HOA even way out here. Whispering Pines Development has rules about property upkeep." Andre had simply nodded, already seeing what the place could become. He'd grown up helping his grandfather fix everything from broken fences to leaky roofs. Those childhood lessons would serve him well here. The homeowners association didn't worry him either. He'd read through every line of the covenant before signing. His military precision left nothing to chance. The monthly dues were reasonable, and the rules seemed straightforward, nothing that would interfere with his vision for the property. "My grandfather always said land is the one thing they can't make more of," Andre told his friend Tyrell as they walked the property line that first weekend. He tried to buy land back in Mississippi in the 1960s, but the banks wouldn't give him a loan. Not for a black man, no matter how good his credit was. Tyrell whistled as they reached the back corner of the property, where a natural spring fed into a small pond.
"Your grandfather would be proud, man."
Real proud. Every free weekend and most evenings after work, Andre poured himself into transforming the ranch. The Army had taught him discipline and determination. Those qualities, combined with countless YouTube tutorials and help from fellow soldiers, allowed him to stretch his modest budget far beyond what contractors would have charged. First came the critical repairs to the house. A new roof, updated plumbing, and electrical work that wouldn't burn the place down. Then he focused on the land itself, clearing brush and repairing fences. He planted native grasses that would thrive in the Texas heat without excessive watering. By the end of the second year, the transformation was well underway. The house, while still simple, had become a comfortable home with wide windows that caught the breeze and a wraparound porch where Andre could sit with a cold drink after a long day's work. "You're making this place sing," his mother said during her first visit from Houston. She ran her hand along the porch railing he had sanded and stained himself. "Your grandfather used to say that land speaks to those who listen. Looks like you've been listening real good." The third year, Andre added a small stable. Growing up in the city, he'd never imagined owning horses, but his Army buddy Chris was being deployed overseas and needed someone to take his 2-quarter horses. "Just till I get back," Chris had said, "maybe a year at most." But when Chris returned and saw how the horses had settled in, how Thunder, the more temperamental of the two, would come trotting up when Andre called, he shook his head. "They're home," Chris said simply. "I'll find new ones when I'm settled." Andre insisted on paying him for the horses anyway. It was the right thing to do, and besides, he had never felt as peaceful as he did riding across his own land in the golden hour before sunset. The neighbors in the scattered homes of Whispering Pines had been cautiously friendly at first. Andre understood their hesitation. A single black man in a neighborhood of mostly white families stood out. But over time, as they saw his dedication to the property, most warmed up. Mrs. Rodriguez from down the road brought over homemade tamales when he fixed her mailbox after a drunk driver knocked it over. Old Mr. Thompson, a Vietnam veteran, would stop by to check on those horses. Though Andre suspected the old man just enjoyed having someone who would listen to his war stories without judgment. Not everyone was welcoming. The Carsons, whose large home sat on the hill overlooking several properties including Andre's, rarely returned his waves. Once he overheard Mrs. Carson at the local hardware store commenting about property values when she saw him in the next aisle. Andre had simply continued selecting his paint colors, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. By year 5, the ranch had become everything Andre had dreamed of, and more. The house gleamed with fresh paint, and the land had recovered its natural beauty. The small vegetable garden produced enough that he could share with neighbors and still have plenty to freeze for winter. The horses had been joined by 6 chickens that provided fresh eggs and endless entertainment with their quirky personalities. His fellow soldiers from Fort Sam Houston would often visit on weekends, helping with big projects or just relaxing around the fire pit Andre had built near the pond. Those evenings, filled with laughter and stories under the vast Texas sky, made all the hard work worthwhile. "You've built something special here," his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Washington, told him during a unit barbecue Andre hosted. "Not many people can say they've created a place like this with their own 2 hands." The lieutenant colonel's words had stuck with him. In a world where his worth was often questioned simply because of his skin color, Andre had created something undeniable. The ranch was physical proof of his capabilities, his vision, and his persistence. His grandfather had been right about land being the foundation of generational wealth. Andre had started a modest investment account, but the increasing value of his property, now worth nearly triple what he'd paid, represented the bulk of his net worth. More importantly, it represented freedom, a place that was entirely his own where he answered to no one. Well, almost no one. The HOA still required annual inspections and approval for major exterior changes, but Andre had built a reputation as a conscientious homeowner. His property was often in better condition than those of the HOA board members themselves. The annual inspections had become mere formalities, usually resulting in compliments rather than complaints. That changed subtly when Gerald Franklin became HOA president. The retired banker brought a new level of strictness to enforcement. Suddenly, residents were receiving notices for infractions as minor as garbage cans left at the curb a day too long. Andre made sure to stay well within the rules, not wanting to give Franklin any reason to focus on his property. "Man's on a power trip," Terrell said during one of his visits, after hearing about Franklin's latest crackdown on unapproved mailbox designs. "Some folks get a little authority and lose their minds with it." Andre just shrugged. "Long as he sticks to the actual rules in the covenant, I've got nothing to worry about." Then came the deployment orders. Afghanistan. 18 months. Andre's 3rd tour, but his first since buying the ranch. The timing wasn't ideal. He'd just finished plans for a small workshop where he could pursue his growing interest in woodworking. That would have to wait now. More pressing was figuring out how to maintain the property while he was gone. Andre made careful arrangements. His cousin would check on the house monthly. The horses would board at a nearby stable run by a retired Army sergeant who gave military discounts. The chickens would go to Mrs. Rodriguez, who had fallen in love with them during her visits. Most importantly, Andre prepaid his HOA dues for the entire deployment period, plus an extra 6 months as buffer. He sent formal notification to the HOA about his military deployment, including his military contact information and his cousin's phone number for emergencies. Everything was done by the book, with the thoroughness that had become second nature during his 12 years of military service. The week before his departure was a flurry of activity. Andre worked from dawn until well past dusk, making sure everything was in perfect order. He mowed the pastures one last time, trimmed all the trees away from the fence lines, and made sure the house was immaculate inside and out. His last night on the ranch, Andre sat on his porch until the early morning hours, listening to the familiar sounds of his land, the gentle nickering of the horses in their stable, the chirping of crickets, the distant call of a whippoorwill. The quarter moon cast enough light to silhouette the oak trees he'd planted along the driveway. "I'll be back," he whispered to the darkness, a promise to himself and to this piece of earth that had become so much more than just property. The next morning, dressed in his uniform, Andre took one final walk around the perimeter of his land. He stopped at the pond, watching the sun sparkle on its surface. His grandfather had always told him that land was the most valuable thing a man could own because it was the only thing that would outlast him. Standing there, Andre felt the truth of those words deep in his bones. This land would be waiting for him when he returned, a piece of America that was undeniably his, something worth fighting for, worth protecting, something to come home to. He locked the house, double-checking every window and door, then loaded his bags into his truck. As he drove down the gravel driveway, he glanced in his rearview mirror at the ranch growing smaller behind him. 18 months suddenly seemed like an eternity, but he'd be back. This was home, and nothing was going to change that. 6 months into Andre's deployment, the scorching Texas summer gave way to a mild fall. Back in Whispering Pines, changes were underway that would have made Andre's blood run cold had he known about them. The annual HOA election had brought a complete overhaul of the board. Gerald Franklin, who had served as president for the past year, was replaced by Victor Harmon, a real estate investor who had recently purchased 3 properties in the development. With him came 4 new board members, all sharing Harmon's vision of improving property values through stricter standards. "We need to bring Whispering Pines into the modern era," Harmon announced at his first meeting as president. "Some of these properties are dragging down values for everyone else." Though he didn't name specific homes, several longtime residents exchanged knowing glances. They had heard Harmon at a neighborhood barbecue, questioning why certain elements had been allowed to purchase in the development. The meeting minutes posted on the HOA website made no mention of the heated exchange that followed when Mrs. Rodriguez asked if the board would be respecting the prepaid dues of residents currently deployed overseas. "Rules are rules," Harmon had replied with a dismissive wave. "Military service doesn't exempt anyone from maintaining community standards." 2 weeks later, the first notice appeared on Andre's front door, printed on bright orange paper. It cited violations of Section 8.3 of the Covenant, excessive growth of natural vegetation, exceeding acceptable height limits. Andre's cousin Thomas found it during his monthly check of the property. He took photos of the yard, which showed nothing more than the native grasses Andre had intentionally planted, now reaching their natural fall height of about 2 feet in some areas, well within the HOA's 3-foot limit. Thomas called the number on the notice, reaching Diane Lowell, the new HOA secretary. "I'm checking on behalf of my cousin, Staff Sergeant Andre Williams," Thomas explained. "He's deployed to Afghanistan, and this notice doesn't make sense. The property is exactly as it's supposed to be." "The board has revised the standards," Lowell informed him coldly. "Natural vegetation is now limited to 18 inches in height. The violation needs to be addressed within 10 days to avoid fines. But my cousin prepaid his dues and filed deployment paperwork. There should be notes in his file about his military status." "I'm not seeing any such documentation," Lowell responded. "But the violation stands regardless. Military service doesn't exempt residents from compliance." Thomas spent his weekend cutting back the grasses, muttering under his breath about power-hungry bureaucrats. He took before and after pictures, sent an email documenting the work, and assumed that would be the end of it. It was only the beginning. 3 weeks later, a second notice appeared, this time citing improper maintenance of exterior structures. The small stable where Andre's horses had lived supposedly showed signs of disrepair and unsafe conditions. Thomas's photos showed otherwise. The stable was in perfect condition, exactly as Andre had left it. He filed another dispute, this time sending copies to Andre's military email, unsure if his cousin would even receive them in Afghanistan. The third notice came just 2 weeks after that. Alleged improper fencing requiring replacement of the entire perimeter, fence to meet updated standards. The estimated cost of compliance, $8,200. By now, Thomas recognized the pattern. He drove to the HOA office demanding to speak with Harmon directly. "This is targeted harassment," Thomas insisted, spreading the notices across Harmon's desk. "My cousin's property is one of the best maintained in Whispering Pines. He's serving our country overseas, and you're manufacturing violations." Harmon leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "The board is simply enforcing standards equally across all properties. If your cousin had concerns, he should have addressed them before leaving. He filed all the proper paperwork and prepaid his dues for the entire deployment." "We have no record of such arrangements," Harmon replied smoothly. "But if you'd like to bring the property into compliance on his behalf, we're happy to provide a detailed list of the necessary improvements." The detailed list arrived by certified mail 3 days later. It included replacing all fencing, removing the stable entirely, re-landscaping the entire property, and repainting the house in an approved color scheme. Estimated cost of compliance over $30,000. Thomas tried contacting Andre through every channel he could think of: email, military contacts, even writing to his unit. But Andre was stationed at a forward operating base with limited communication access. The few messages that made it through were brief and focused on mission updates, with no indication he understood the severity of the situation back home. Meanwhile, the fines began accumulating. $100 per day per violation. Within a month, the HOA claimed Andre owed over $9,000 in fines. Then came the notice of intent to place a lien on the property. Thomas sought legal help, but the local attorney he could afford gave him little hope. Texas property laws give HOAs enormous power, the lawyer explained. Without proof that your cousin filed deployment paperwork, and without his direct involvement, challenging this will be difficult. Thomas scraped together enough money to pay the most pressing fines, hoping to buy time until Andre could respond. But the HOA refused his partial payment. Payment must be made in full, Lowell informed him. Partial payments are not accepted for accounts in violation status. What Thomas didn't know was that Harmon had already been in talks with Sunset Development Group, a company looking to build luxury villas in the area. Whispering Pines, with its scenic views and proximity to San Antonio, was prime real estate. Andre's 5 acres with its natural spring and pond was particularly desirable. 9 months into Andre's deployment, the HOA filed foreclosure proceedings. The notice was posted on Andre's front door and sent to his home address, not to the military contact address his cousin had repeatedly provided. Thomas discovered the foreclosure notice during his regular check of the property. Panicked, he contacted the JAG office at Fort Sam, Houston, where a sympathetic legal clerk explained that without Andre's direct authorization, they couldn't intervene officially. Get your cousin to contact us immediately, the clerk advised. There are federal protections for deployed service members. This foreclosure may be illegal under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, but reaching Andre had become nearly impossible. His unit had moved to a more remote location, and communications were even more restricted. The foreclosure proceeded with shocking speed. Under Texas law, the HOA utilized a non-judicial foreclosure process, requiring only posting public notices and a sale on the courthouse steps. No court hearing was necessary. Sunset Development was the only bidder at the foreclosure auction. They purchased Andre's ranch, the land, house, and all improvements for $145,000, less than half its market value of $350,000. The sale covered the fabricated HOA fines, fees, and legal costs, with the remaining balance supposedly held for Andre. Within days of the sale, bulldozers arrived. The house Andre had painstakingly renovated was demolished first. The stable followed. Trees he had planted were uprooted. The pond was drained to make way for a retention basin that would serve the planned development of 12 luxury villas. Mrs. Rodriguez watched in horror from the road as workers tore into the property. She took videos with her phone, her hands shaking with anger. "This isn't right," she kept saying to anyone who would listen. "That boy is serving our country, and they stole his land right out from under him." But most neighbors kept their distance, afraid of drawing the HOA's attention to their own properties. A few whispered about how Harmon had been overheard at the country club, boasting about cleaning up the neighborhood and increasing everyone's property values. Thomas made a desperate attempt to halt the construction, showing up with the deployment paperwork and arguing with the foreman. He was removed by security and threatened with trespassing charges if he returned. By the time the first concrete foundations were poured, a "Coming Soon" sign had been erected at the entrance to what was once Andre's driveway. Whispering Pines luxury villas, starting at $750,000. The official property records made no mention of the fact that the previous owner was an active-duty soldier deployed overseas. The HOA minutes contained no record of the discussions about Andre's property before the violations began. On paper, everything appeared legitimate. A property owner had failed to maintain HOA standards, accumulated fines, and lost the property through legal channels. But Mrs. Rodriguez kept her videos. Thomas kept all the correspondence and notice photos. And 14 months into his deployment, Andre finally received a batch of delayed messages from Thomas, including photos of the construction site that had once been his dream. The message that accompanied the devastating images was simple. "They took it all, cousin. While you were fighting for the country, they stole your land, but we've got evidence. This isn't over." In the dust and danger of Afghanistan, thousands of miles from home, Staff Sergeant Andre Williams stared at his phone screen in disbelief. The land that had been his anchor, his future, his piece of the American dream, gone. replaced by concrete foundations for luxury homes he could never afford. His commanding officer found him sitting alone that night, still clutching his phone, his face a mask of shock and rage. "They can't do this," Andre kept saying. "Can they?" The answer would spark a battle unlike anything Andre had trained for. A fight not with weapons, but with laws and rights that were supposed to protect those who protected the nation. The military base in Afghanistan ran on its own rhythm, disconnected from the normal flow of life back home. For Andre, days blurred together in a haze of missions, equipment maintenance, and brief periods of rest. His thoughts often drifted to his ranch during quiet moments, imagining the changing seasons. The way the morning light would hit the pond, the horses grazing in the pasture. "Williams, you've got a scheduled call in 10, his unit commander, Captain Reynolds, called out as Andre was finishing his dinner in the mess hall. Andre nodded, grateful for the rare opportunity. Communication with home was limited and precious. He'd been trying for weeks to set up a video call with his cousin Thomas after receiving those disturbing messages, but between mission schedules and technical issues, it hadn't happened. The communication tent was air-conditioned against the Afghan heat, a small luxury that made the plastic chair feel almost comfortable as Andre waited for the connection. When Thomas's face appeared on the screen, the forced smile told Andre everything he needed to know before a word was spoken. "Show me," Andre said simply. Thomas hesitated. "Maybe we should talk first." "No, I need to see it." Thomas nodded, his expression grim. "I'm driving there now." About 5 minutes out, Andre watched the familiar landscape of his neighborhood pass by as Thomas drove. Children played in front yards. Neighbors watered gardens. Normal life continuing while his world was being demolished. The HOA president, this guy Harmon, he pushed it all through so fast, Thomas explained as he drove. Used some loophole for non-judicial foreclosure. By the time I found a lawyer who'd take it seriously, they'd already sold it and started construction. Andre said nothing, his jaw tight as the truck turned onto the road leading to his property. "I'm so sorry, man," Thomas said softly as he pulled to a stop. "I tried everything I could think of." He turned the phone camera away from his face, and Andre felt like someone had punched him in the chest. Where his ranch house had stood was nothing but dirt and concrete foundations. The oak trees he'd planted along the driveway were gone. The stable, demolished. Construction equipment sat idle in the afternoon sun. Yellow monsters that had devoured his dream. A large sign near what had been his front gate proclaimed Whispering Pines, luxury villas starting at $750,000, with an artist's rendering of identical two-story houses packed tightly together. They drained the pond, Thomas narrated as he walked the perimeter of the property, careful to stay on the public road. "They're putting in some kind of man-made lake with a fountain instead." Andre couldn't speak. His hands gripped the edge of the table in the communication tent so hard his knuckles turned white. "Security kicked me off last time I tried to go closer," Thomas explained, his voice tight with anger. "Threatened to have me arrested for trespassing." "On your land, man. Your land." Andre finally found his voice. "The horses? They're good. Still at Sergeant Taylor's stable. He said they can stay as long as needed, no charge. Said it's the least he can do for a fellow soldier." Andre nodded, grateful for that small mercy. His eyes never left the screen, taking in every detail of destruction. The spring that had fed his pond was now just a muddy patch surrounded by tire tracks. The wild blackberry bushes at the back of the property bulldozed flat. "Mrs. Rodriguez has been documenting everything," Thomas continued, panning the camera to show more of the construction. "She's got videos from the day they started tearing things down. She tried to stop them, but they threatened to call the sheriff on her too." Something caught Andre's eye on the screen. "Wait, go back to that trailer." Thomas turned, focusing on a small office trailer at the edge of the site. "Sunset Development Group," Andre read from the logo on the side. "Who are they?" "Some company that works closely with the HOA. Too closely, if you ask me. The CEO plays golf with Harmon every Sunday. Word around the neighborhood is they had this planned for months." Andre was silent again, his mind racing through options, none of them good. He was thousands of miles away, fighting one battle while another had been lost in his absence. "I've kept everything," Thomas said, turning the camera back to his face. "Every notice, every email, every response. I've got photos of the property showing there were no violations. Mrs. Rodriguez has her videos. Old Mr. Thompson even wrote down conversations he overheard at the community center about how they were finally going to clean up the neighborhood. The implied meaning wasn't lost on Andre. As one of the few black property owners in Whispering Pines, he'd always sensed the undercurrent of resentment from certain neighbors. Despite his immaculate property, "Have you talked to anyone at the base?" Thomas asked. "There's got to be laws protecting soldiers from this kind of thing." "I'm going straight to my CO after this call," Andre said, his shock transforming into determination. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." After ending the call, Andre sat motionless for several minutes, processing the images he'd seen. Everything he'd worked for, gone. The house he'd rebuilt with his own hands. The land he'd nursed back to health. His future. Captain Reynolds found him still sitting there, staring at the blank screen. "Everything okay at home?" she asked, then read his expression. "What happened?" The words came out in a controlled fury as Andre explained the situation. Captain Reynolds' expression darkened with each detail. "That's not just wrong, it's illegal," she said when he finished. "The Service Members Civil Relief Act specifically protects against this exact situation." She checked her watch. "The JAG office will be closing soon, but I'm calling them anyway. This can't wait." Within an hour, Andre was sitting across from Major Luis Ortega in the Judge Advocate General's office. The military lawyer listened intently, taking detailed notes as Andre relayed everything Thomas had told him. "This is one of the most blatant violations of SCRA I've ever heard," Major Ortega said when Andre finished. "The act specifically prohibits foreclosure on a service member's property during active duty and for 1 year afterward without a court order." He leaned forward. "And to obtain that order, they would have needed to prove you were notified and had an opportunity to respond." "I never received any court notices," Andre confirmed. "Just those violation letters Thomas told me about, and those came to my house, not to my military address." Major Ortega nodded grimly. "That's their first mistake of many." He pulled out a legal pad. "I need you to authorize us to act on your behalf. We're going to need all the documentation your cousin has collected, plus your deployment orders and proof you provided your military contact information to the HOA." Andre signed the forms Ortega pushed across the desk, feeling a small spark of hope for the first time since seeing the destroyed property. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we bring the full weight of the United States military legal system down on their heads," Ortega said, his voice calm but determined. "We'll file for an emergency injunction to halt further development. Then we go after both the HOA and this development company for violating federal law." Ortega paused, studying Andre's face. "There's one more thing we should discuss. Given the circumstances, specifically the fact that you provided proper notification of your military status, prepaid your dues, and maintained your property in good condition, we have to consider whether there were other factors in their decision to target your property." Andre understood immediately. "You're talking about racial discrimination." "I'm saying it's a possibility we need to investigate," Ortega replied carefully. "If we find evidence that race was a factor in how they treated your property differently from others, that adds violations of the Fair Housing Act to our case." As Andre left the JAG office, his phone buzzed with a message from Thomas. "Mrs. Rodriguez heard them talking at the construction site today. They're rushing to get foundations poured for all 12 villas by end of month. Said something about making it impossible to undo." Andre forwarded the message to Major Ortega, then called Thomas back. "Tell Mrs. Rodriguez to keep documenting everything," he instructed, "and spread the word to anyone who might have heard anything. We need all the evidence we can get." For the first time since deployment, Andre's thoughts weren't on his military mission, but on the battle waiting at home. The ranch had represented everything he'd worked for, his piece of the American dream. He'd fought for his country on foreign soil, and now he'd have to fight for his own rights on American ground. That night, as he lay on his cot in the barracks, Andre stared at the ceiling and made a promise to himself. This wasn't just about getting his land back. It was about making sure no other soldier lost their home while serving their country. It was about standing up to people who thought they could take advantage of his absence. Tomorrow would bring another patrol through dangerous territory, but now Andre had 2 missions: complete his deployment honorably and then reclaim what was rightfully his. And with the United States Army behind him, he finally had the reinforcements he needed for the fight ahead. The wheels of military justice began turning with surprising speed. Within 48 hours of Andre's meeting with Major Ortega, the JAG office had filed emergency injunctions in federal court to halt all construction on the property. By the end of the week, a cease and desist order had been delivered to both the HOA and Sunset Development Group. The construction crews arrived one morning to find federal marshals posting notices at the property entrance. Work was to stop immediately, under penalty of significant fines. The yellow bulldozers and excavators stood frozen in place, like abandoned toys in a giant sandbox. Victor Harmon, the HOA president, received the legal documents with visible shock at his country club office. The development company's CEO, Richard Clayton, was served during a charity golf tournament, his face flushing red as other players watched the process server approach. Neither man had expected such a forceful response. They had assumed that a soldier deployed overseas would have neither the resources nor the time to challenge their actions. They had not counted on the United States Army taking the matter personally. Back in Afghanistan, Andre received updates through a secure military channel. Major Ortega sent regular messages, careful to include only essential information without classified details of the case strategy. Injunction granted. Construction halted. Gathering evidence for main case. Stay focused on your mission. We've got this front covered. Those brief messages gave Andre something he'd been missing since seeing the destruction of his property: hope. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe he might actually get his land back. What Andre didn't know was that his case had caught the attention of someone much higher in the chain of command. Brigadier General Patricia Carter had seen the initial filing cross her desk and immediately pulled the file. 20 years earlier, her own father, a Vietnam veteran, had lost his small farm to predatory lending practices while struggling with PTSD. No one had fought for him then. She had joined the JAG Corps partly because of that injustice. "I want daily updates on the Williams case," she instructed her staff. "And I want to know exactly who authorized that foreclosure when the law clearly prohibited it." General Carter's interest meant resources. A team of 4 JAG officers was assigned to work exclusively on Andre's case. They began by interviewing residents of Whispering Pines, carefully documenting every interaction with the HOA board. Mrs. Rodriguez sat at her kitchen table, serving coffee to 2 JAG officers as she played her videos of the demolition. "They knew he was in the Army," she said firmly. Everyone knew. Andre was proud of his service, had a flag flying on his porch, hosted a 4th of July barbecue for his unit before he left. The officers took careful notes, then asked, "Were any other properties subjected to the same level of violation notices and enforcement?" Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head. "The Petersons' fence has been falling down for 3 years. The Johnsons have an unauthorized shed in their backyard. Nobody said a word to them. But Andre's place, perfect condition, and suddenly it's violation after violation." Similar interviews with a dozen other residents painted a consistent picture. The HOA had applied its rules selectively, targeting Andre's property while ignoring actual violations on other properties. Mr. Thompson, the Vietnam veteran who had befriended Andre, provided the most damning testimony. He'd overheard a conversation between Harmon and another board member at the community center 3 months before the foreclosure. Harmon said, and I quote, "Once we get that 5 acres back in the right hands, property values will finally recover." The other fellow asked if it was legal, and Harmon laughed and said, "He's halfway around the world. By the time he figures out what happened, it'll be too late to do anything about it." Thompson's hands shook with anger as he signed his statement. They counted on him being too busy serving his country to defend his own property. Disgraceful. The JAG officers also subpoenaed all HOA records, board meeting minutes, and communications related to Andre's property. What they found in emails between board members shocked even the experienced military lawyers. "Need to move quickly on the Williams situation. That property is the key to the whole Sunset deal. Clayton says they can't make the numbers work without all 5 acres for their villa project. Concerned about potential legal issues with military status. Can we establish a pattern of violations before moving to foreclosure? Neighbor complaints received about inconsistent neighborhood aesthetic. Perfect opportunity to begin enforcement actions." The most revealing email came from Harmon to Clayton just weeks before the first violation notice. Demographic changes in Whispering Pines concerning many long-term residents. The Williams property situation gives us a chance to address these concerns while significantly increasing surrounding property values. When these emails were presented to the federal judge overseeing the emergency injunction, she extended the construction halt indefinitely and ordered all assets related to the property frozen pending full investigation. Meanwhile, the story began to spread. Thomas had reached out to local veterans groups who were outraged by the treatment of an active duty soldier. The American Legion Post in San Antonio organized a weekend protest at the Whispering Pines entrance, with dozens of veterans in uniform holding signs supporting Andre and condemning the HOA's actions. Civil rights organizations took notice as well. The implication of racial bias in the HOA's actions brought attorneys from national advocacy groups who offered to file supporting briefs in Andre's case. Local news stations picked up the story, interviewing neighbors and showing before and after images of Andre's once beautiful ranch, contrasted with the half-built construction site. The publicity created pressure from unexpected directions. Other homeowners in Whispering Pines began questioning the HOA board's actions at monthly meetings. Sunset Development's investors called emergency meetings, concerned about being associated with a case that now involved allegations of violating a service member's rights and possible discrimination. 16 months into his deployment, Andre received a video call request from General Carter herself. He sat nervously at attention as her image appeared on the screen. "At ease, Staff Sergeant," she said with a slight smile. "I wanted to update you personally on your case." Andre relaxed slightly but remained respectful. "Thank you, ma'am. The federal court has granted our petition for an emergency hearing next week. Given the evidence we've uncovered, particularly the communications between the HOA and the development company, we believe we have a very strong case." Andre nodded, hardly daring to hope. "What happens at the hearing, ma'am?" "We're asking the court to invalidate the HOA's foreclosure and sale on multiple grounds: violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, failure to provide proper notice, and evidence suggesting discriminatory intent in their enforcement actions." She paused, studying Andre's face. "I want you to know that this case has implications beyond your personal situation. The way they targeted your property while you were deployed serving your country is unacceptable. We're making it clear that the United States Army stands behind its soldiers, even when they're thousands of miles from home." Andre swallowed hard, fighting to maintain his composure. "I appreciate that, ma'am. More than I can say. There's something else you should know," General Carter continued. "Your case has attracted attention from the highest levels. The Secretary of the Army has been briefed. This isn't just about getting your land back, Williams. It's about ensuring no other service member faces what you've experienced." After the call ended, Andre sat alone in the communication tent, overwhelmed by the support rallying behind him. When he'd purchased that small ranch, he'd seen it as his private dream, his own piece of America. Now it had become something larger, a symbol of the rights of those who serve their country. Captain Reynolds found him there, a rare smile on her face. "Good news from home?" Andre nodded. "The Army's fighting for my land. Really fighting for it?" "Of course they are," she said simply. "You're one of ours. We don't leave our people behind, not on the battlefield, and not in the courtroom." That night, Andre wrote a long email to Thomas, asking him to visit the property and take pictures of the construction halt in progress. He needed to see that frozen moment, that first victory in what would likely be a long battle. Thomas replied within hours, attaching photos of the abandoned construction equipment, the federal notices, and something unexpected, a small American flag planted at what had been the entrance to Andre's driveway. Beside it, a hand-painted sign read simply, "This land belongs to a U.S. soldier, hands off." The message accompanying the photos said, "Mrs. Rodriguez put this up." Then Mr. Thompson added his flag. Now there's a new one appearing almost every day. The whole neighborhood is watching, waiting. They know the Army's coming for those thieves, and man, they can't wait to see it. For the first time since learning of the theft of his property, Andre slept soundly that night, a printed copy of that last photo tucked under his pillow. The federal courthouse in San Antonio stood tall and imposing under the bright Texas sky. Inside, courtroom 4 was packed to capacity. Veterans in formal uniforms sat shoulder to shoulder with Whispering Pines residents. Reporters filled the back row, notebooks ready, At the plaintiff's table, Major Ortega and his team of JAG officers arranged stacks of evidence folders with military precision. Across the aisle, Victor Harmon sat stiffly beside his attorney, his usual confidence noticeably absent. The CEO of Sunset Development, Richard Clayton, occupied the next table with his own team of corporate lawyers, their expensive suits and leather briefcases conveying a silent message about the resources they were prepared to commit to this fight. Thomas had arrived early to secure a front row seat. Mrs. Rodriguez sat beside him clutching a small American flag. Old Mr. Thompson, wearing his Vietnam veteran cap, nodded respectfully to the JAG officers as they made final preparations. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff called the court to order. All rise. The United States District Court for the Western District of Texas is now in session. The Honorable Judge Eleanor Washington presiding. Judge Washington, a no-nonsense woman with 30 years on the federal bench, entered and took her seat. She surveyed the crowded courtroom with experienced eyes before speaking. We are here in the matter of Williams, fight with Spring Pines Homeowners Association and Sunset Development Group. This is a hearing on the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment to invalidate foreclosure proceedings and subsequent property sale. She turned to the military lawyers. Major Ortega, you may proceed. Major Ortega stood, his posture reflecting his military background. Your Honor, this case represents one of the most egregious violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act that the Judge Advocate General's office has encountered in recent years. Over the next hour, he methodically laid out the case. Andre's proper notification to the HOA regarding his deployment, the prepayment of dues, the fabricated violations that appeared only after leadership changes in the HOA, the failure to send notices to Andre's military address, the rushed foreclosure process without court approval. The law is absolutely clear, Your Honor, Ortega emphasized. Under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, foreclosure against an active duty service member requires a court order. No such order was ever requested or granted. As he spoke, images appeared on the courtroom screens. Andre's well-maintained property before deployment. The violation notices, the demolition and construction. Several veterans in the gallery shook their heads in disgust as the evidence mounted. Furthermore, Ortega continued, we have compelling evidence that Staff Sergeant Williams's property was specifically targeted, while actual violations on other properties were ignored. He introduced the emails between HOA board members and Sunset Development, reading the most damning passages aloud. The courtroom grew silent as the words demographic changes and get that 5 acres back in the right hands echoed through the room. When the defense attorneys took their turn, their arguments seemed hollow against the mountain of evidence. They claimed procedural errors rather than intentional wrongdoing. They suggested that the HOA had simply been enforcing community standards. They argued that Sunset Development had purchased the property in good faith, unaware of any improprieties in the foreclosure process. Judge Washington interrupted their arguments repeatedly with pointed questions. Are you suggesting that the HOA was unaware of Staff Sergeant Williams's military status when these actions were taken? The covenant allows for fines, certainly, but where in the document does it authorize changing standards without notifying all homeowners, including those deployed overseas? How do you explain the email specifically mentioning demographic changes in reference to the Williams property? By the time closing arguments concluded, the direction of the judge's thinking was clear to everyone in the courtroom. She called a brief recess before delivering her ruling, but few people left their seats unwilling to miss a moment of the proceedings. When Judge Washington returned, her expression was stern. She didn't mince words. The evidence in this case presents a disturbing pattern of actions taken against a citizen soldier while he was serving this nation overseas. The law is designed specifically to protect service members from exactly this type of predatory behavior. She looked directly at the defendants. I find that the foreclosure and subsequent sale of Staff Sergeant Williams's property violated the Service Members Civil Relief Act and was therefore illegal and invalid. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Thomas grabbed Mrs. Rodriguez's hand, both of them fighting back tears. I hereby order the immediate nullification of all sales documents and the return of the property to Staff Sergeant Williams. The judge continued, her voice gaining strength. Furthermore, I order that all structures built by Sunset Development be removed and the land restored to its previous condition at the defendant's expense." She wasn't finished. Given the evidence of potential discrimination and the deliberate targeting of Staff Sergeant Williams's property, I am referring this matter to the Department of Justice for investigation of possible violations of the Fair Housing Act. Finally, she addressed remedies. The defendants will jointly cover all costs of property restoration, including rebuilding the house and stable to original specifications, replanting trees, and restoring the natural pond. Additionally, I am awarding punitive damages in the amount of $450,000 to compensate Staff Sergeant Williams for the emotional distress and loss of use of his property. Thomas pumped his fist, silently. Mrs. Rodriguez whispered a prayer of thanks. The veterans in attendance sat tall, vindicated by proxy. This court will maintain jurisdiction over the restoration process to ensure full compliance with this order. Judge Washington concluded. We are adjourned. The gavel fell with finality and the courtroom erupted in muted celebration. Major Ortega turned to shake hands with Thomas, a rare smile breaking through his professional demeanor. "It's over," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. He got it all back. "Justice was served today," Ortega replied. "Now we make sure they follow through on every detail." 12,000 miles away, Andre received the news via a secure message from General Carter herself. Complete victory. Property returned. Full restoration ordered. Punitive damages awarded. Justice served, Staff Sergeant. For several minutes, Andre sat alone on his bunk, the message blurring through his tears. Everything he had worked for, everything that had been stolen was coming back to him. The system that he had sworn to defend had in turn defended him. The restoration process began immediately under court supervision. Sunset Development's half-built villas were methodically dismantled. Soil engineers assessed the land and developed a restoration plan for the natural features. Architects used Andre's original photographs to design an exact replica of his ranch house and stable. 5 HOA board members, including Victor Harmon, were removed from their positions. 3 faced civil penalties for their role in the illegal foreclosure. The Department of Justice investigation into housing discrimination resulted in additional fines and a consent decree requiring oversight of the HOA for 5 years. Most importantly, the case led to state legislative changes strengthening protections for deployed service members' property rights. A bill named after Andre was fast-tracked through the state legislature, closing the loopholes that had allowed the HOA to proceed with a non-judicial foreclosure against an active duty service member. 4 months after the court ruling, Andre completed his deployment and returned home. As his plane touched down in San Antonio, he felt a mix of emotions he couldn't fully name: relief, vindication, gratitude, and lingering anger at what had been done. Thomas waited at the airport, embracing his cousin with fierce pride. "Wait till you see what they've done. The judge has been breathing down their necks every step of the way." The drive to Whispering Pines was filled with updates about neighbors, the restoration progress, and the fallout from the case. As they turned onto the road leading to Andre's property, he wasn't prepared for what awaited him. Lining both sides of the road were people, dozens of them. Veterans in uniform, neighbors holding welcome signs, Mrs. Rodriguez waving her small American flag, even strangers who had followed the case in the news and wanted to witness this homecoming. At the entrance to his driveway stood Captain Reynolds and Major Ortega in full dress uniforms, flanking a new gate that hadn't been there before. Beyond them, Andre could see his ranch house, rebuilt exactly as it had been down to the color of the porch swing. As he stepped out of the truck, the crowd broke into applause. Captain Reynolds saluted him, then stepped forward to shake his hand. "On behalf of the United States Army, welcome home, Staff Sergeant Williams." Major Ortega handed him a set of keys and a folder of documents. "Your property deed fully restored to your name, with a court order preventing any future HOA interference with your basic property rights." Andre walked slowly through the new gate, taking in every detail of his restored land. The house gleamed with fresh paint. The stable waited for the horses' return. Young trees stood where his old ones had been, smaller but alive and growing. The pond reflected the afternoon sun, its water clear and undisturbed. Near the pond, a small stone marker had been placed. Andre knelt to read the inscription. On this land, justice prevailed. property of Staff Sergeant Andre Williams, protected by the laws he swore to defend. As the sun began to set on his first day home, Andre sat on his rebuilt porch watching the visitors gradually depart. Thomas brought out 2 cold beers, handing one to his cousin before taking a seat beside him. "What now?" Thomas asked after a comfortable silence. Andre looked out over his reclaimed land, feeling its familiar peace settling into his bones once again. "Now I plant new trees. Bring the horses home, maybe start that woodworking shop I was planning." He took a long drink, then added quietly, "And I make damn sure this never happens to another soldier. Ever."